The research clearly shows that women have a favorable effect, like response to creatine, but then there's this resistance by a lot of women saying, well, it's gonna do this. So do you recommend creatine for your female clients, especially ones that are physically active?
I do. Typically at a dose, I would say probably about 3 grams a day, where you see men typically about 5 grams a day. I usually don't recommend a load for male or female athletes, but for women, I think there is just getting over the stigma of them being afraid that it is going to cause a bunch of water retention or a bunch of rapid weight gain, where there may be a little bit of weight gain right out of the gate. That's probably going to adjust and fluctuate. But I have seen my women clients to be quite successful building muscle mass and just increasing strength. There's actually an awesome empowerment when I see women start to actually begin to experience the strength increases and enjoy building strength, realizing that they're not just going to come in the gym being this massive bodybuilder, but actually building lean tissue is very, very metabolically healthy for them. It's very good for their endocrine system. So I just love seeing women be like, wow, I hit a new PR today. It's because they're getting more confident in the fact that they're actually building strength.
Hey friends, welcome back. So today's show with Josh Kreifels is brought to you by Myoscience Nutrition. We're talking a lot about metabolic health, about movement, about activity. And one tool that can help you, especially if you crave carbohydrates or junk food at night, is a natural compound called berberine hydrochloride. We've upgraded the berberine fasting accelerator that features not only a high concentration of a high quality berberine hydrochloride, but it also has synergistic nutrients like alpha lipoic acid and biotin. So you can liken this to a fasting accelerator. This is not something that you use right before you go to the gym. It's used to kickstart your fast, which for many people is in the early part of the evening. We talk a lot today with Josh about time-restricted feeding, about compressing your feeding window, and not snacking and having junk food and that sort of thing in the evening time, which I know for some of you is challenging. Those are the times that I generally crave unhealthy foods. And so that's why I use the berberine fasting accelerator. 1 to 2 capsules can actually help you kickstart your fast. Again, for most people, they think about fasting in the morning, but you should be starting your fast in the early evening or at a minimum by like 7 or 8 o'clock. So this is a tool that can help you do just that. I would implore you to check out some of the many reviews over at myoscience.com. I'll put links to the updated and improved berberine fasting accelerator. This is a natural ingredient that has a long dossier of literature to support its benefits. It's been used in China for well over 1,500 years. And now it's being used all throughout the Western world, and particularly here in the US by individuals like yourself who are looking for solutions to help accelerate some of the benefits linked with fasting. So you can save over at Myoscience by using the code podcast at myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com. And I'll put links below, and let's cut back to it with Josh. But with regards to the SARMs, it's crazy like how quickly that changes blood work in a negative way. Like I've seen some people before and after, people I've worked with, and then just people on Instagram that I know who are quote unquote influencers said, hey, look, I did a cycle of SARMs. I felt like it was safer than doing actual steroids, but my blood work shifted, and I want you to take a look at it. And like hemoglobin, hematocrit, like all the viscosity related markers went through the roof. And it was crazy like how quick that happened. So, I don't know if you've had any experience like working with people that have been on SARMs, because I think it's a safer alternative to steroids. But
yeah, and I have had clients that have taken them or have asked about them, and they're so new that there just isn't enough like long-term data, like you're saying. And so even like AST, ALT, your liver enzymes, like I have seen like a spike in these from some of these oral agents. Whereas things like testosterone, I mean, people run TRT pretty conservatively for long-term, and you're not going to have those same metabolic effects like with your hematocrit and just that thickening of the blood. So I think there will be a big surge of research coming and just kind of new evidence coming out showing that, hey, this is really not as clean as it, quote unquote. I think it's really for the people that don't want to take injections and they're like, oh, I'm going to go like the pro hormone like phase. Like when I was early on teenager, like you can buy pro hormones like GNC.
Yeah.
And that was like the thing to do. It's like take a pro hormone. It's not steroids, but it's supposed to help me get bigger. So I think that's what people's like conception of SARMs are, is it's really just meant to be a safer option of anabolics.
I agree with you. I mean, if someone was in their 40s, they had low testosterone, they were working on all the lifestyle stuff, sleep and nutrition and exercising, and if they had low T, definitely suggest just going on HRT before SARMs. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think, especially under the supervision of a doctor, I think there is a lot of upside to testosterone. I mean, as from a society-wide, men are getting lower and lower in testosterone. There's many different reasons why for that, but I think most people, there is a stigma around testosterone. People are like, oh, I'm on testosterone. Like, they don't really like to talk about it, not realizing that it's not just about libido. It's not just about muscle mass. I mean, energy, vitality, retaining of muscle mass, and just having that mental clarity, that drive to actually do things in life. You need testosterone, which you know. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Now, when you're testing with your clients, are you using the Dutch test or serum testing? What do you like to do?
Yeah, combination of both. Mostly it's been serum testing, transitioning into getting more into Dutch testing and do more like full picture, whether it's Dutch testing, whether it's oats test and things like that, just really looking at not only the hormones, but also the metabolites. I kind of say this for like a very basic way for clients to understand. A serum test is really kind of like the thumbnail of a YouTube video. And you look at things more comprehensive, like either a Dutch test or do like multiple tests, and you can get more of the actual picture of what's going on. Cause I mean, you know that hormones can change like day to day or even from morning to night just based on your kind of external environments.
Right. No, that's a great point. I like that, the thumbnail. And then you actually, if you want to look deeper at the metabolites in this, yeah, it's a great way to look at that. So going back to, I want to, sort of unpack, because a lot of people want to put on muscle, burn fat. You're a bigger guy, 185. You look like you've been lifting for quite a while. So you competed in 2014. You did a couple shows, and then you went to get your master's degree, right? And become a dietitian and things like that. So what got you out? I know we were talking about offline, but what kind of got you out of that bodybuilding community? I mean, you still lift weights, but how come you're not pursuing that anymore?
Yeah, it's been a journey for sure. It started with me going through that competing world, and personally, part of my story is having a little bit more of a disordered eating pattern because of that restriction, because of that lifestyle, because of that obsessive nature. I even transitioned from being obsessive about the actual food I was eating to then being obsessive about only eating organic food. And if it wasn't organic, I wasn't going to touch it. And so I am all for 100% for organic food, but I think the mindset behind where I was not in a good space. And so I actually had to kind of break through that and be okay with eating non-organic foods for a period of time to actually break down those barriers. And so going through that whole journey has kind of led me into a passion of actually helping people go from kind of where they're at off the couch or in any sort of capacity of fitness to actually optimizing their health and wellness, just because I want to eat better, I want to sleep better, I want to think better, I want to move better. And so if I want to do those things for me, I want to encourage other people around me to like experience those same benefits. I don't think we're here on this earth to just exist. I think we're here to thrive. And we're seeing a gap in people thriving and the people that are thriving. And I was at a conference not too long ago, and they were talking about there's a lengthening in the gap between metabolic age and biological age, in the sense where you could have a 40-year-old person who biologically is 40 years old, but maybe metabolically 65. And so digging more into like, what's the root of that is where I'm passionate about, and helping people kind of unlock that root of how do I actually improve my metabolic age to where maybe you're 40, but you have a metabolic age of 25, which I think is, I mean, you talk about it a lot. So
that's a great point. I mean, I think we're seeing a huge disconnect, and I talk about this with practitioners all the time. Sometimes when they say their age, if they're aging gracefully and they exercise and they eat well, they're 50 and they look like they're 40. But there's some people who are 30 and they look like they're 45. And so, yeah, this disconnect, and there's that whole epigenetic age clock and my DNA. Have you experimented with that yet before?
Not necessarily like on like the testing level, but epigenetics like fascinates me like crazy, just because I have clients that are like, oh, my genetic predisposition for this, and this. I'm like, okay, that's a great place to start. However, your lifestyle is number one. Your lifestyle, your diet, how you think, how you move, how you manage stress, how you effectively manage trauma is going to ultimately turn on those genes or not. So yes, your genome is who you are, but you have a huge influence on what that looks like for you and for future generations.
Yeah, really important for people to recognize that. I think it's almost sometimes a scapegoat, right? You can say like, oh, well, genetically I'm prone to X, Y, or Z, but like you said, I mean, it doesn't mean that those genes will necessarily be expressed. And even if you have a genetic predisposition, if you change your environment, you can augment, the expression of those genes. So yeah, it's really important to acknowledge that. Okay, so you got out of fitness to focus more on health, and then you did a residency Is that how you would call it?
Yeah, internship. Residency, yeah.
With you did some sports aspects and so forth, but worked with diabetics and in the dialysis unit. And we were talking about that. I think that's really neat. But one thing that stood out when we were talking about that is some of these people are getting dialysis sometimes 12 hours a week. They're still consuming soda and junk food because why? Like what's up with that?
Yeah, and there's so many layers to that. At the point where someone's on dialysis, their health is very, very compromised. And so it's not like they just woke up one day and all of a sudden they're in stage 5 kidney failure and they're having to be dialyzing 3 days a week for 4 hours. But that's kind of a journey where you have to actually break into that addictive behavior of sugar and unhealthy foods, not realizing that it has a direct correlation on A, how much you have to dialyze, and B, like what your life expectancy is. Like if you continue to do this, you're obviously going to be, and I saw people losing limbs, losing fingers because they weren't managing their blood sugars while they were on kidney failure. So It's just amazing to me. But it's cool from a dietetic perspective to see how much nutrition actually does play a role in acute and chronic disease. Like it's so critical. I believe it's the foundation for everything that we do.
So you take two people who have kidney failure. You put one person on a whole foods diet, they're exercising, they're doing everything from the lifestyle perspective, another person eating all the crap, right? Is person A who's being healthy, they might need 2 hours a week versus 12, or is it like how dramatic can you shift the pendulum in terms of, a chronic condition like that via nutrition and lifestyle?
Yeah, and I think the minimum is typically around 3 to 4 hours a week per session. So about 2 to 3 sessions. I will say in my experience, what I saw is people that were on it with their diet, they did everything you told them to do. They were managing well with medications, things like that. Their length of time that they were actually on dialysis was shorter. And so they were able to get in, get out. And also it increased their likelihood of getting a transplant. And so people that were actually taking care of themselves were moving up on the list of the transplant list and then either getting a transplant and then not having to dialyze anymore, or the quality of their life was significantly better because they're managing their disease process through healthy habits.
That's impressive. Now, most of these people, is the root cause behind their kidney failure from diabetes, or are some people, it could be cadmium exposure, lead exposure, whatever. There's all these different reasons. What would you say, from working with these people, was the number one reason why they had kidney failure?
Geographically, where I was, I would say a very large percentage of them were diabetics. And that's just related to the food accessibility there, and just kind of the culture of the South is high sugar, high fat meals. And so we didn't dig deep into as far as root cause in terms of like doing like oat testing or like GI map to look at their microbiome or any of these more like functional labs, quote unquote. It's more so just mainstream. What's your A1C? What's your like blood sugar? What's like your lipids, HDL, LDL, triglycerides? And you would see these things that would be off the charts. And so these people are all metabolically extremely unhealthy, i.e. why they're sitting in a chair for 12 hours a week dialyzing. But yeah, it would be interesting to kind of dig in deeper and figure out actually what was the catalyst for that. Was it strictly diabetes, or was it something else that actually led to the diabetes on the front end? So I'm not sure.
That's interesting. And you wonder why the kidneys, is it just the glycolytic damage within the kidneys, the nephrons and so forth that causes the failure? Is that part of I haven't really dove into that. Like why do the kidneys preferentially, it's one of the organs that fails first. I mean, the liver's getting infiltrated with fat as well. And then you have other issues, but but then when you would see the extremities become amputated, was it fingers first or legs first or toes? Like, was it all over the place?
It was all over the place, person dependent. A lot of people would get like to the point where they could not move their fingers just because they had so much calcification in their fingers, which is a process of end-stage kidney disease, is your calcium and parathyroid hormone and things like that getting all sort of out of balance. So it would start with fingers, and some people had maybe 1 or 2 fingers lost, and they would kind of figure out that they can manage this better. Other people, it was whole hands, it was whole legs. We had people that would come in on wheelchairs, dialyze, and then leave on wheelchairs because they didn't have any legs. They couldn't walk. So it was a wide variety. I would say there was more people that weren't amputated, but that just kind of goes to show you the progression of the disease and how you could dialyze for multiple years, or you could dialyze for a couple months and you could amputate because of that inflammation in your vessels. And that's really where it comes to, is that inflammation. The sugar creates that damage to the endothelial lining of the vessels. And so that actually starts to, instead of like cholesterol being the trigger, it's more so sugar to actually start breaking down the blood vessels, which obviously filters through the kidneys and compromises that. Your body just can't flush out enough sugar. You end up peeing a very sugary urine because your body can't like clear all of the sugar. And so your kidneys get damaged, then you get fatty liver, which obviously increases inflammation elsewhere in the body. So it's a whole cascade.
Wow. I mean, these are images that, so if you go to Canada and you buy a carton of cigarettes, they usually have pictures of lungs that are necrotic from smoking and people that have emphysema and they have like a tracheostomy and things like that. These should be pictures that should be on like soda cans, you know, and show people like, hey, you could lose your fingers, you could lose your eyes, you could lose your legs, because I think that would especially cause parents to maybe not want to give them to children. And so as kind of a add on to that, when you would go home from working with these people, I bet the last thing you wanted was ice cream or bread. Like you were like, oh my gosh, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to work, because you see that, you're like, wow, this is, you know, if you make a few wrong decisions over years, like this could potentially be anyone, you know, with that, in that situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just the amount of sugar that's in like children's food. And there's obviously many reasons for that, but the food industry is designed obviously to make foods that are very flavorful and pleasureful. And so if they are doing that, it's increasing their profit margin. And so going after a more compromised population, i.e. children that just don't know, or parents that just don't know any better, giving their kids a Mountain Dew and then sending them off to bed. You know what I mean? It's just, it's not going to be all that conducive. They're not thinking like nutrition as a 401k investment. They're thinking of it's like, it's just a deposit into your bank. I'm just going to put in something in my mouth to fill a void versus actually, no, I have an ability to change the trajectory of the next 40, 50, 60 years of my life, plus generations to come by reducing some of these more unhealthy habits.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I like that. I like to refer to nutrition and metabolic health like an investment. You know, a lot of people are keen on their SEP or their IRA or their 401k, but investing in getting rid of the metabolic debt that they've maybe accumulated over the years. So I love that you use those analogies, which is great. Speaking of the kidneys, and you have obviously extensive background in fitness, when people hear about creatine, they do think about, oh my gosh, creatine's bad for the kidneys. It's bad for women. Let's clear the air on creatine. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, so creatine is a natural substance that we consume in meat. Taking it in supplement form, it's obviously a higher concentration. It's probably one of the most researched athletic aid supplements on the market. There's also a difference between creatine and creatinine, which is that blood value that you see on your blood test. So people may see, oh, I have elevated creatinine. It must be the creatine I'm taking. In my experience, most healthy individuals have healthy kidneys and can tolerate 3 to 5 grams of creatine a day. Based on what I've seen, based on what I've read in the research, that's pretty well recognized. Now, obviously, there's situations where people may be compromised. And so if they have any sort of kidney damage at all, I wouldn't say, hey, you probably should continue taking this. You may back off, get some more lab work to actually figure out why your kidneys are struggling in the first place. But from what I've seen from the research I've read, I believe it to be safe. I don't know if you have any like difference of opinion,
No,
but
100%, yeah.
It is something that we are getting, just like you're taking amino acids. You're getting amino acids from meat. You're getting amino acids from a supplement. You're getting creatine from beef and things like that, some of these other meats. So it's something, I mean, the research is really good as far as building strength and building energy. I mean, it's an energy system that your body uses. Your brain needs creatine. So there is another stigma surrounding creatine, some myths surrounding that as far as like bloating and water retention, things like that. But
well, I think I want to hear your thoughts on this, because when creatine first came out in the late 90s, it was paired with, I think, 4 parts dextrose or maltodextrin for every 1 part creatine. So if you were to do a loading dose of say 5 grams or 10 grams of creatine per day, you were potentially getting 40 to 60 grams of dextrose or maltodextrin. And for some people, they're already consuming soda and this. So you're getting all this highly refined sugar. We know that sugar, it does impact water retention and sodium excretion and all these things via insulin. So I think that was part of the stigma, or that was the reason why the stigma around creatine causing kidney failure, water retention, muscle cramps was probably because of that. But I haven't looked in terms of the academic research. That's just my own sort of inference from looking at this. But what do you think? Is that it?
yeah, and I think even just going after the myth of that it kind of dehydrate you or leads you to cramps, it does increase the water holding capacity of your muscles. So to actually dehydrate you is kind of counterintuitive if it's actually increasing the amount of fluid that's in your muscles. And then cramping, if you're increasing hydration, increasing electrolytes and things like that, that's actually in the muscle. There may be situations where people are cramping on it. I would also look at what's your sodium and electrolytes levels the rest of the day. Are you in a hot climate? Are you sweating profusely? When I was working with the football team down in my internship in Houston, like we were giving these guys 8 to 10,000 milligrams of sodium a day. And they were still cramping. So it's like, what is the actual cause and effect? Is it the creatine? Is it electrolytes? Is it heat? Is it some of these other kind of variables? Is it your muscles are just deconditioned? But from what I've seen, I see it to be effective. Yeah. And I think that the research is pretty clear on that as well.
That's amazing. I want to circle back to salt in a minute, but the thing about creatine that I think is also fascinating is women don't store as much as men, and they have lower body levels due to the differences, gender speaking, with muscle mass. But the research clearly shows that women have a favorable effect, like response to creatine. But then there's this resistance by a lot of women saying, well, it's going to do like they have these. Anyway, so do you recommend creatine for your female clients, especially ones that are physically active?
I do. Typically at a dose, I would say probably about 3 grams a day, where you see men typically about 5 grams a day. I usually don't recommend a load for male or female athletes. But for women, I think there is just getting over the stigma of them being afraid that it is going to cause a bunch of water retention or a bunch of rapid weight gain, where there may be a little bit of weight gain right out of the gate. That's probably going to adjust and fluctuate. But I have seen my women clients to be quite successful, building muscle mass and just increasing strength. There's actually an awesome empowerment when I see women start to actually begin to experience the strength increases and enjoy building strength, realizing that they're not just going to come in the gym being this massive bodybuilder, but actually building lean tissue is very, very metabolically healthy for them. It's very good for their endocrine system. So I just love seeing women be like, wow, I hit a new PR today. It's because they're getting more confident in the fact that they're actually building strength. So
that's awesome. What's the difference in the mindset with those clients versus clients who are afraid of touching weights because the misconception really that they're going to turn into a mass monster? Have you noticed any characteristics that are similar or different in those two different groups?
I mean, with women specifically, there is always, in my experience, getting through that initial barrier of, hey, you need a resistance train. I think that's something that is not historically been common for women to do. You don't historically see women in the weightlifting area. You see them typically in the cardio area. And so there's a stigma in the fitness and health community that women aren't lifting weights. There is a shift in that. I think the popularity of the competition world, but also women just getting more advanced in the weightlifting like sector. I think that there is a big shift of now it's probably 50-50.
Yeah.
Maybe at the gym, or even maybe sometimes more females, which is awesome just to see that. But there is that mindset, that barrier to entry of, hey, you're not going to become a mass monster. This is actually going to be really, really effective for you. Like you're going to start sleeping better. You're going to feel better. You're going to have more strength, more vitality. Obviously being more metabolically healthy and strong is good for pregnancy, getting
bones.
Through like bones, everything like that. And so that's a big one that I harp on for women. Like, hey, you need to do resistance training because when you're in your 50s and 60s and you're post-menopause, like you need to be thinking about bone density. They're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. It's like, you have to start now.
That's awesome. Okay, we talked about creatine. Let's talk about another carnonutrient that's quite popular for fat loss because it helps with the transportation of fat, and that's carnitine. I personally don't recommend generally people supplement with this unless they don't eat meat or they're vegan or whatever, but I want to hear your thoughts on carnitine specifically for fat loss.
Yeah, with some of these more like fat loss agents, it really, I mean, it is a supplement. It's supposed to supplement the other things you're doing in your life. And I know in your book, you talk about kind of the calorie in, calorie out aspect, but for the foundation of most people, that's where I start, is that calorie in, calorie out. Okay, let's optimize your nutrition. Let's figure out, okay, what are your composition of calories? How much protein are you getting? Most times it's just increasing protein for women, and they experience body composition improvements. With carnitine, I can honestly say I've probably recommended it maybe 2 or 3 times in probably over 1,000 people that I've coached. And that's for people that are competing, and at the end stage, they're already doing everything like with top like excellence. And so if we can get maybe a percentage or 2 more performance out of it, decrease in body fat, then that's probably something that I would suggest. I do know people that inject it and have pretty good results of it. That's not something that I am knowledgeable on, but I do know people do and have good results personally.
Wow.
But those are also kind of peak athletes and people that are optimizing other areas, whether it's other PEDs or optimizing their nutrition, optimizing their training. So for the general population, it's probably not something I'm going to be advocating for.
And what about caffeine and thermogenics? I mean, it's controversial, stand efforting, when other people will say never use caffeine before a workout. I like coffee, so maybe it's my bias saying, look, I mean, if caffeine helps you have a better workout and it's earlier in the day, that's my perspective. But what do you think about these different stimulants?
Yeah, I think from a performance perspective, the research is pretty clear that caffeine does increase performance. I think from the actual, if you look into kind of what a thermogenic is doing, it's just increasing heart rate. And so your heart rate is increasing, you're creating more work, i.e. potentially burning more calories. Are those calories coming from sugar? Are those calories coming from fat? I don't ever recommend thermogenics. Or pre-workouts and kind of caffeine, coffee, things like that. I allow with my clients, dependent on what's your total caffeine intake and also when are you taking it during the day. If you're one that works out after work and you're scooping 300 milligrams of caffeine at 5 o'clock at night, I'm probably gonna be like, hey, your sleep is gonna be pretty disrupted, and that's more important to me than if you can do 10 pounds more on a specific movement. So if it's earlier in the day, I personally drink 1 cup of coffee a day. I haven't taken pre-workout in years, and that's just a preference thing. Just I want to optimize my sleep, and I know if I take caffeine too late in the day, that my sleep will be hindered. So that's a personal preference, but I think there's different metabolizers of things like that. But
sure, I agree 100%. But it's really common, unfortunately, that many people are taking, whether it's NO Explode or all these different, I can't even remember some of these, Red Line, there's all these different pre-workouts at 4 or 5 p.m. And they expect that they're going to be able to fall asleep at 10 o'clock at night. It's like, there's no way.
Yeah.
Your sleep, I mean, maybe they're taking sleep aids. So it's like you're robbing Peter to pay Paul and having to medicate in other ways. And it just creates this vicious cycle that is not good.
Yeah, and the other thing I see with that, and something that I've been able to see with data with my Oura Ring, is just because I'm sleeping doesn't mean my quality of sleep is good. And so where people may be taking this pre-workout at 5, 6 o'clock at night may be able to go home and fall asleep, get 6 to 7 hours, maybe 8 hours, and wake up and do it again the next day. But how much deep sleep are you getting? How much are you optimizing recovery? Getting that actual natural growth hormone release in your sleep. You end up just kind of being a hamster on a wheel, if you will, taking caffeine, not sleeping, taking more caffeine, not sleeping, taking more caffeine, versus actually reducing that, giving your adrenals a break and optimizing your sleep, which is really where we're getting our muscle building time.
So with your cup of coffee, there's this new sort of idea, Andrew Huberman and other people have talked about this, letting the adenosine build up a little bit as you wake up in the morning, then having caffeine maybe at 10 o'clock, let's say you get up at 6 or 7, to sort of sensitize those adenosine receptors, as opposed to waking up and having a cup of coffee. What do you delay the onset? You said you have a cup of coffee every day. Is it within the first half an hour, or are you one of those to wait a little bit?
I used to be someone that I needed coffee to function to get up, and ended up having a second cup of coffee later in the day. And I've kind of transitioned out of that to where I don't need coffee, to be honest with you. I enjoy the taste of coffee, and so I drink a mold-free organic coffee. The one that I use has some reishi spore extract in it, which kind of helps, obviously, with all the therapeutic benefits of that. But I'm probably within the first hour upon waking. I like to kind of move. I typically wake up, turn my sauna on, let that heat up, drink a cup of coffee, and just kind of have a slower morning, and then go in sauna and start my kind of morning routine that way. But I've definitely been one where it's like, hey, I need coffee now. Otherwise, I can't even think straight.
Yeah.
But being able to actually reduce my coffee dose and then using a really good, pure quality coffee has been a big impact for me.
And what brand is that?
It's King. It's Organo King coffee. I saw it on some functional medicine people on Instagram, so I thought I'd give it a shot. It's a little bit earthier. It comes in individual sachets, but what I didn't know about coffee is it's a very common area for mold. And so not wanting to obviously ingest mold or be around mold, that was a big one for me. And then all the herbicides and pesticides that coffee is so heavily sprayed with, I wanted to make sure I was getting a really pure organic coffee. So that's what I use. I would say probably 80% of the time, maybe the other 10 to 20% of the time, I may get coffee like an Americano out somewhere, but it's usually just drinking that King coffee.
That's cool. Yeah, the coffee is Interesting. So I've been composting for a while, and I noticed the first things to get moldy, like I have a little compost bin I can share with you later in the kitchen, is coffee and grains. Like literally, and because having backyard chickens, like sometimes the grains will be left out because chickens are really messy. But it's those two things, like it's corn, wheat, coffee, of course, fruit over time,
Yeah.
you know, but it's really interesting. So I do wonder about the packaging, the processing, all of that. Like, is there mold spores that you don't really see? So I think that is an important aspect that we don't really talk about, right? We go to Starbucks or we go to get a coffee at the airport and don't think about these things. And I know you do, so that's great for sharing that. Any other sort of workout specific, like we talked about creatine, carnitine, pre-workouts, caffeine. There's beta alanine and some of these other arginine type compounds that can be utilized as a pre-workout. You know, how do you feel about those?
I like them. I've used them in terms of kind of their process, just increasing performance. Beta alanine increasing like the intensity that you can train at, just because that acts as a buffer there for your muscles. Arginine increasing blood flow. I've used it in spot treatment. I've used it in higher doses before a workout, and obviously it helps. You can notice like you feel that big pump. I would say it's more of a sustained pump. The pump isn't necessarily what's making you build muscle. It feels good. You look good. But that intensity at which you're training is kind of what's really important to break that stimulus, to break down the muscle. Right now, personally, I just take some coffee in the morning and then I just go to the gym. I don't typically like supplement with any like extra, even over the counter supplements. And that's just because I'm really like trying to fine tune what my body needs and really like figure out timing and things like that. So I don't know if there's any specifics that you're using that have been beneficial for you that you kind of recommend.
I don't supplement with them anymore. I mean, I used to, and I sometimes do like the feel, but finding a clean brand, right? I mean, the problem with many of these workout specific supplements is you get ACE-K and saccharose and coloring agents, and it's like, it's hard to find like a good vasodilator that's clean, right?
Yeah.
So I just say, screw it. I just like you. I'm like, sometimes there's this local kombucha company that has a beet kombucha.
Yeah.
So I'll have beets. Beets have, nitrogen compounds in there that
Right.
So sometimes I'll have that intra-workout or something, or some fruit. But yeah, I like supplements, and I supplement with creatine and electrolytes and berberine and things like that. But I don't take these other things. But a lot of people do, so I'm just curious, what you think.
I mean, you mentioned electrolytes, and there has been a time where I've carried a container of salt in my gym bag and just take a pinch of salt and put it in my mouth and just kind of either pre-workout or mid-workout. I mean, it's a vasodilator, and so it also helps with fluid balance and whatnot. So some of those more basic things, beets, another one. I've seen like Coach Eugene on Instagram do like dark chocolate, things like that. I haven't seen the real fruit of that, the benefit of doing dark chocolate before, but he does it along with pomegranate juice, just some of these other probably just increased nitric oxide.
I think with chocolate, you would probably need it in like a hot cocoa. I don't know because the density of the polyphenols because I did a lot of research in this actually, and I would notice in college, because I was doing this pharmacology of drug action, had to do a report on a natural compound, and it was the cocoa polyphenols. And I did notice on my trainer when I was a little bit more vascularity, if I did a cocoa drink as opposed to the bar, because the bar with the fat, I think it probably delays absorption a little bit.
Okay.
But anyway, I think you're probably going to get a little bit better results with like citrulline arginine combo.
Yeah.
But I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about that coach. Going back to protein, and specifically protein's hot right now. Gabrielle Lyon, Ted Naiman, all these people are talking about prioritizing protein, then figuring out the macros from there. But I know energy balance is a big aspect for you. So when you're starting with clients, and maybe it's proprietary, so if that's cool, if you don't want to dive into all the details, but what trackers do you like to use for people when figuring out their overall sort of resting metabolic rate and where their macros should be? And then from there, how do you sort of decision diamond, how prioritizing protein based on lean mass or total body weight? Like how do you navigate that?
Yeah, great question. I think in my experience, most people actually undereat. And so when they come to me, I intentionally attempt to overfeed them. And I'm very clear that, hey, I'm going to overfeed you. If your weight goes up over the next couple of weeks, I'm okay with that. I just kind of want to see where your baseline is, because I've seen it all over the map. I have a client that's seemingly extremely muscular, competed in classic physique, and his basal metabolic rate is very low. Versus I've had women that don't really do much resistance training, and their basal metabolic rate is through the roof. Like I can't feed them enough. It's just insane. Like I have bikini competitors that are eating more than classic physique competitors just because their metabolisms are so fast. So typically I start with protein. Usually I go between about a gram to a gram and a quarter per pound of lean body weight, which is typically higher than most recommendations based on like, especially in dietetic school and things like that. I'd say the research is probably more in favor of more protein for body composition, for blood sugar regulation, for satiety and things like that. So depending on the person's weight, obviously if I get a 200-pound female, I'm not going to give her 200 pounds of protein. So I usually go off ideal body weight in those situations. But if it's someone who's probably pretty close to an ideal body weight, I may go up to about a gram per pound. And then in terms of fat and calories or fat and carbs, I'll base off what I think based on their vocation, based on kind of what their experience is through their intake form, how much they're working out, what their activity level is kind of give them a target. But I would say for most women can't consume 2,000 calories a day. That's kind of the baseline that we see in like just across culture is eat 2,000 calories a day. In my experience, most women cannot handle 2,000 calories a day. And so what that looks like is actually dropping them a little bit below, taking them through a deficit phase and actually going through a rebuild phase where we're able to surpass their original maintenance based on a really good reverse diet phase.
Mm-hmm. And is that one of the best ways to sort of overcome this diet-induced suppression of metabolic rate is the reverse diet phase?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you know what metabolic adaptation is. And so these people that are either chronic dieters or chronically living at a low calorie intake, your basal metabolic rate actually drops. And so really the only response to that is you have to get it back up to what a true maintenance should be. And that getting it from, let's say someone's consuming 1,200 calories a day and their maintenance used to be 1,800 calories a day. Chances are they're not going to be able to tolerate going from a normal intake of 1,200 calories a day to 1,800 calories a day overnight. So you would go through that reversal process where they're actually starting to increase their food. Their workouts improve because they have more food, they have more energy. Meanwhile, keeping their weight somewhat stable. And I've seen that time and time again, taking clients through that reverse phase where their weight stays within 5 pounds of what their low was, but their calorie intake is upwards of sometimes 750 calories more a day. And they haven't really changed physically. So
that's so interesting. And is this change in energy, is that pretty palpable for most people? Because a lot of people are just tired. Like, oh, I would go to the gym, but I'm just exhausted. I'm just trashed. And then you do kind of look at what they eat, and it's usually pretty light. Like maybe like a light or diet yogurt or something for breakfast, a coffee, and then maybe like an apple for like, do you think it's a big part of that fatigue? Obviously, there's a million reasons why, but how much of that fatigue is just like that metabolic adaptation from just undereating for years, do you think?
So I think it's huge in terms of actually having people seeing the connection between eating more and their energy levels. There are so many different caveats to it, but when people start realizing that food is fuel and carbohydrates are fuel, there's a stigma in the fitness and kind of health community that carbs make you fat. And when you can actually walk through that and realize that carbs are just an energy source, and if you want to prioritize your carbohydrates pre-workout, you're probably going to go into your workout with better performance. And so I'm seeing that massively, a huge shift mentally, physically in both men and women of just increasing calories and allowing them to perform better just by having more energy.
It's a great point. And especially this having carbs in context. I've been maybe guilty of promoting all the health benefits of the ketogenic diet. And then that leads people into this dichotomous thinking, well, if ketones are good, then therefore carbs must always be bad. But they don't realize that in context, like anaerobic type explosive movements, resistance training, carbs can be very helpful. So yeah, I've been, helping people to better understand that. But there is this binary thinking where, oh, ketones are good, burning fat is good, so therefore I can't consume these other things. But we need to realize that even if you're so-called keto or low carb or carnivore, when you go to work out and say you do resistance training, you're not really burning fat during that workout, right? You're utilizing carbohydrates. So why would you try to be a hero and do that in a zero carb state? Like that's why. I mean, I understand if you have psoriasis or multiple sclerosis, and if you have a blueberry, it flares. Okay, I get it in those people, but most people are not in that situation. So
yeah,
I'm glad that you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you model this really well as kind of that cyclic approach, whether it's time restricted feeding, whether there's some aspect of a ketogenic diet, but also there's times where you are going to consume carbohydrates. I think that's the appropriate approach, to be honest, not necessarily being 24/7, 365 in ketosis. There may be times where it's probably more metabolically advantageous to be in ketosis if you're going to operate more in the ketone lane. And also like timeline, like how old are you? I believe probably in my lifetime, when I'm probably 40 plus, I'll probably adopt more of a lower carbohydrate diet. Not necessarily going all the way to ketosis, but a lower carbohydrate diet just to optimize energy intake and fat and everything like that. And so that's a personal preference thing. And that's something I think you do really, really well.
Yeah, no, that's I appreciate that. And I think that's, something people should recognize. But going back to longevity, because we talked about the benefits of almost overeating. And for some people that they've been chronically dieting. So therefore their thyroid hormones, their resting metabolic rate has been suppressed. And there's this whole thing about calorie restriction. And if you want to optimize longevity, that you should be in sort of a calorie deficit and so forth. So how do you mentally maybe talk to people about this or just think about this yourself? Because I myself have been eating a lot more food than I historically do, feel better. I might not be as lean or whatever. And maybe I lose 2 years off lifespan, whatever, which I don't really care about. I would personally rather feel better while I'm alive than theoretically try to optimize lifespan and have lower muscle mass, lower strength, lower energy. How do you conceptualize that?
Yeah, and that's a great point as far as not being necessarily concerned about taking 2 years off of your lifespan. I don't think most people are thinking in that frame of mind of thinking long term of hey, how can I actually optimize my life now? I mean, you could be quote unquote healthy based on lab work, look healthy, you're living a healthy lifestyle, but there still could be things, whether it's traumas or emotional state, that you are not healthy. And so are you truly living at that point? Are you so obsessive with the labs? Are you so obsessive with how you look in the mirror? Are you so obsessive with performance in the gym that you're actually missing the other probably 90% of your life? And so actually having some sort of balance and allowing people to be hey, you're not as lean as you once were, but you're still your intake is higher than it's ever been. Your energy is better than it's ever been. You're increasing so many other areas that are non-scale victories. Let's focus on those. And then people start to realize, oh my gosh, yeah, you're so right. I'm in a life season. I'm enjoying life. I'm thriving. I have joy, which you may not have had before. And so really just helping people kind of make the connection between the physical and the mental has massive implications for people.
Mm-hmm. And how do you help people reframe that? Because that is sort of it takes more awareness for some people to be able to to hear that message and then be able to do something with that. Because like you talked about with your own, is it okay if we call it orthorexia, obsession with being healthy? And I've been there before. That is very socially isolating and sort of depressing, and it's lonely because you cannot be with other people who are just living a normal life, maybe going and getting ice cream from a grass-fed ice cream shop or whatever. Yeah. Are there books or recommendations where how do you lead people down that path?
I think this is really just where being able to tell my story and have empathy and just kind of going through that whole phase of disordered eating or orthorexia to where now I follow more of an intuitive eating approach. I don't track my own food. And so being able to take people on that journey of, hey, look, I've been in your shoes. This is what worked for me. This is what I see you could do. I've seen people kind of start to open up to that. And really it just, some people need wins to build momentum. Some people need momentum to build wins. Honestly, sometimes it's just affirming that people it's okay to have a couple wins. It's okay to have a couple setbacks. That's a part of natural progression of life. Mm-hmm. And so for me, even being able to now take that intuitive eating approach where I would say probably 98% of the stuff that I purchase, that I cook is organic. But if I go out to eat, go to a restaurant, there's things that I know that I'm not going to be able to control as far as seed oils and probably some sugars or some other things. But that's not a large percentage of my diet. And so, whereas you get people that is a large percentage of their diet versus the stuff they're eating at home may also be unhealthy. It's allowing people to be healthy 80% of the time to the best of their ability and still leave room for flexibility. I mean, I think that's honestly what's going to be sustainable and, in my opinion, the healthiest outcome.
Yeah, I love that approach. Are there some foods at restaurants that are complete non-negotiables for you? Fried foods or French fries, onion rings, bread? If we go out to a restaurant, I'll frequently have a burger or a steak with no bun or something like that. And maybe I'll have a French fry or two. But are there things where they're hard nose, you are not going to touch what is that?
This has changed for me because I found out about 2 years ago that I have celiac disease. So a hard no would be gluten. Typically, if I go out for a burger, I'll order a gluten-free bun, still consume fries. Again, those are things that I eat probably on a low percentage basis, but not restricting myself to the point of like, hey, you can't go enjoy a meal, things like that. Knowing that I'm going to go back home and I have healthy food and I'm just going to get right back into my practices the next day. I personally stay away from soy. And then fried foods, most things are typically fried in like canola oil. So straight up buttered, battered, fried things, obviously I physically cannot eat. I don't have a palate for them. And so I'm also not a sweets guy. Like if I am going to get ice cream, like it may be like a non-dairy, like we have a local, I don't know if you've been to Frankie and Joe's in Seattle.
It's good.
Super good, like non-dairy ice cream. But I just am not motivated by sugar and sweets. So that's my own thing. I would much rather have like a really savory steak with some sweet potato fries versus like some sort of dessert. So that's my own preference. But I would say the non-negotiables just would have to be gluten and then soy for me. And I try to stay away from conventional dairy. If it's in something, I'm not going to like jump all over the place about it. But if it's my preference, I will make substitutions. Hey, no, I won't get dairy on the cheese or on the burger. I won't get this, whatever, cream sauce or something like that. I'll ask for an alternative. But
And so what was involved in you testing or figuring out, how did you figure out you were in your 30s when you got diagnosed with celiac disease?
Mid-20s.
Okay.
So I actually got bit by a tick beginning of 2020. And that kind of put me down this whole cascade of health and kind of looking at Lyme disease and co-infections and things like that. And ended up having to do about 3 weeks of doxycycline, which destroyed my gut. Previously, I felt like I had an iron gut, like I could eat anything and didn't have any issues. And then after the antibiotic, my gut was not right. And so I ended up doing testing, did a GI map, and just did some other functional testing and realized that I have the antibodies and have H. pylori and some SIBO stuff going on, and then have the antibodies for gluten. And so now if I consume gluten, I notice that I'm very reactive to it, very lethargic. My bowels changed, just very uncomfortable for about a week. And so that's been about a year and a half that I've actually known, but I've dabbled in like kind of gluten-free. My wife is gluten-free. She's had to be. So it's been not a difficult transition for me, but it was more so very abrupt. Like you can eat gluten, then all of a sudden, like you can't eat gluten.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. So I want to get more into that, but the tick bite thing, I think is quite common. And where were you and what season was it? And how did you know that you got
it? Was in May, Western Washington. And I had heard from so many people that ticks don't carry Lyme in Washington. So I was both like, okay, that's good news, but also, is that good news? And so I went through and did all the co-infections tests and things like that. And based on the lab work, did not have Lyme, did not have co-infections. I've been muscle tested for some of these co-infections and have been muscle tested positive for them. So it was in springtime, which I think tick awareness is...
Well, usually spring is the worst when they're coming out.
Yeah.
Did you have the classic bullseye rash and things, or?
So I did not have the classic bullseye rash, but I did develop pityriasis rosa, which is another kind of viral infection that looked like it was either ringworm or a bullseye rash elsewhere on my body. And then started getting these little like red patches all over my torso.
Wow.
And then just did a heavy dose of astragalus for a few weeks, and then sun exposure, and it seemed to go away. And then it came back months later, I think probably after a very stressful event. And so I haven't had it since. I've had those two kind of skin events, but nothing that I know of since. But like I said, I've been muscle tested for babesia and things like that. So working on a kind of a protocol in terms of like detox and drainage to actually kind of eliminate some of those things actively right now.
Wow. Now, do you have any idea of when you think you might have got it specifically and where you were? Like, was it, people talk about high grass or were you just at a park, or do you have any idea of like when?
Yeah, I was actually out in the woods.
Okay.
I was out shooting clay with some friends,
okay.
And just kind of walking through knee-deep grass, brush. It was a kind of an open clear cut, so it wasn't anything that I was like really like trekking through, but it was on my arm and I didn't know about it. And so instinctively I found it about 6 hours later. Its head was buried in my arm.
Oh, man.
And I just instinctively tried to pinch it as low as I could and pull it out. Now knowing that's not how you remove a tick, and just threw it just because it just like instinctively, I was like, oh, get off me.
Yeah.
And then we can never find the tick and send it in for testing or whatnot. But yeah, I was out in the kind of forestry area.
What part? Like where in Washington?
Out past Belfair, like past Union.
Okay. Yeah. Crazy. I mean, I usually don't hike or camp in May or June for that reason. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit of a hypochondriac in that regard. Like I was in Montana in June, but knowing that that's when the most ticks are out. I try to wait till like July, August, and then spend a lot of time and then through the fall. But yeah, I mean, it's scary how many, there's a book called Lab 257. Have you heard about it? All about Plum Island and the theory about where Lyme disease may have come from. And I'll just put it in the show notes. People got to check it out. You got to read it. It's really frightening about how potentially this could have been developed, or these ticks could have been selected for a weapon of mass destruction. And the deer would leave Long Island. Plum Island is on the east side of Long Island, and they would swim across, this is like a mile, and they would get onto Plum Island, which was supposed to be totally isolated, bring the ticks back to Lyme, Connecticut and parts of New York. And anyway, it's crazy. So yeah, it's pretty scary when you start to dig into that and realize like, wow, these ticks could be more virulent because they were literally selected for Anyway, but that being said, I've worked with a lot of functional medicine practitioners, and they all say the host really matters when it comes to any of Borrelia, Babesia, any of these Coxsackie virus, like that your host health really influences the outcome. So you're doing a lot of the right things. I know you want to talk, what's big in your practice right now is detoxification and prevention of endocrine disrupting chemical exposure. You listen to that interview we did with Anthony J and so forth. When you cover the nutrition, the exercise, the lifestyle and all that, how does that fit into your clinical practice with working with people?
Yeah, and this is something that I am very passionate about just because it's so prevalent in our day-to-day. I think this is a pretty good argument that it's not just about calories in, calories out, in the aspect that you could be doing everything right, quote unquote, from a health and wellness perspective on paper, but you may just still feel terrible and you may not be getting results. And so from that, actually diving in deeper of like, actually, what's the root cause of where you're at? For many scenarios, it may be a gut infection. It may be a chronic low-grade infection. To where your body's in this constant state of fight or flight, and you actually can't break down fat effectively because your body's so stressed out. And so what I'm doing with a lot of my clients right now is kind of tapping into some of those more environmental exposures, looking at the water supply, looking at like not using plastics and things like that, which Anthony J just absolutely just mind-blowing to me, all the research that he was talking about. It's just amazing to me, like how many things on a day-to-day basis that we're exposed to that most people, quite honestly, don't know anything about. Mm-hmm. Like people say, don't drink tap water. And you're like, why? It's like, well, it's got heavy metals and like all sorts of like bacteria and things like that in it. And so looking at, for me, from a nutrition perspective, I've seen a huge surge in SIBO or SIFO. And so actually what I've come to realize that the root of that isn't necessarily just a gut issue, but actually starts in the mouth with oral hygiene. And even looking at sugars in some of these unhealthy foods actually changes the composition of the bacteria in your mouth, which you swallow between 500 and 700 times a day. It's no wonder why we have an increase in H. pylori and SIBO and some of these leaky gut issues, which are obviously systemically resulting in all sorts of autoimmune conditions and things like that. So really just diving into the root with people and actually figuring out how to detoxify. I think detox it's a buzzword.
Yeah.
And so what detox actually means, supporting your natural detoxification organs, removing the endocrine disrupting chemicals, whether it's fragrances, whether it's cosmetics, whether it's scents in your homes, whether it's candles, and then taking that one step further. Now that you've reduced the exposure, how do you actually manage your body and help your body rid these things, support your liver, support your kidneys, support your lymph, which, I mean, sauna and cold plunging and things like that, all stuff that I know that you're practicing, help your body actually naturally detoxify, which is awesome.
Totally. That's key. Do you ever do any pre or post testing with people, or do you just assume, I mean, because most people, even polar bears in Antarctica, have perfluoro compounds and phthalates in their blood. Do you just assume that most people have some degree of exposure to these things and then make those recommendations? Or you mentioned the oat test, the organic acid testing. Is that a starting place? Or
yeah, even looking at things like the total toxic burden test, looking at people, I wish I would have done it before I started taking a bunch of like binders and some of these other things to actually kind of rid my body from that. But a good friend of mine who's a chiropractor in the area didn't take anything for an extended period of time, did a total toxic burden test. And he's someone that I would be like, hey, he's living the pinnacle of like low tox living. Like he's not having all of these exposures. And he had multiple things from plastics. He had multiple herbicides and pesticides that he was exposed to. So I look at him and I think, wow, if someone to that level who's actually going above and beyond to actually try to reduce their exposure still has multiple of these things that are 3, 4, 5x of what should be in the body, what is the average consumer that doesn't know anything about this like? Like, no wonder why we have such a like sick, toxic society, is because people are literally living in toxic like things. You know what I mean?
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Food packaging. I mean, this couch we're sitting on, I mean, I specifically, it's a little older now, but made sure that it didn't have flame retardants in it. But most people don't look at that when they're buying. Anyway, it's crazy.
I mean, it's really in everything that you think of. The air that you breathe. Like, we live in Washington, it's a more damp climate, so mold is prevalent. So breathing in mold spores. My wife and I lived in a moldy apartment before we moved into this current place. So having that more tangible experience, that's another thing that most people just don't really think is that big of a deal, is mold. And then you look at people, I have a friend who was completely debilitated, basically had to be taken care of by his wife for a period of time. A young mid-20s, could not function because of mold toxicity. And so here in Washington, obviously that's a bigger issue with the moisture and just the older homes. And so I know you've put in quite a bit of work to try to like freshen up your house and get rid of mold and things like that. And obviously I've seen that whole journey of kind of tearing your house apart in order to kind of rebuild it back up. But mold is a very real thing. And it's not just a thing for moist climates, a thing for like bathrooms and things like that, even if you have dehumidifiers. So,
well, even people, Arizona, Florida, the South, I mean, people think like, oh, well, it's relatively dry here, but yeah, the differences in temperature between the inside and the outside. So if you're running the AC and it's hot outside, you can create condensation. And if your attic is not ventilated, like there's so many layers to it. But I do think people think, oh, mold is a problem for like the Northeast, Northwest. You're like, no. There's people in Florida. There's people in Arizona, Colorado. Like, this is a big deal.
Yeah,
I think it's really important, but I do think that regular sweating, whatever it is, if you can exercise, if you can do hot yoga, if you can't afford a sauna, get a sauna blanket, go in the sun, like any sweating is helpful.
Right.
I think all this stuff is very, very important, you know, for overall health and things that we should be considering. And there's also one aspect, you mentioned calories in, calories out. And there's all sorts of papers. Obviously, that's been the reigning paradigm for a long time, but people speculating that this toxin exposure is influencing the energy balance equation because it does alter some of the metabolic pathways, and potentially the accumulation of fat is a way to dilute some of these toxins. And so I'll put a link to a paper. I'm sure you've read this. It came out a few years ago, like the toxin hypothesis of obesity. And they go through all the different, it's really, really well done. But yeah, I think people should be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even that aspect of people being overly fat or too much body fat, it's just another vector for you to store toxins. And so then when you start losing weight, you start getting healthy, and then you get kind of this whole response of being exposed to that. So really opening up those drainage pathways is critical for people to really make sure that your body's optimized and functioning well.
That's awesome. Josh, really appreciate you coming on. I know you work with people virtually, right? And also in person now, or is it mostly virtually?
Everything is completely virtual now.
Okay.
Yeah, my wife and I have our own functional medicine practice now, and it's entirely virtual. And so it's working with people specifically in that world of kind of endocrine issues and gut issues, specifically kind of looking deeper into the root cause is what we do.
That's awesome. And where can folks find you?
Yeah, right now, just on Instagram, Josh Kreifels RD. We are just about to launch our website. So as soon as that's launched, I'll make that live on our website and everything there. But yeah, really appreciate it, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Cool.
I've listened to your work for a long time. And even as I was in grad school, listened to your podcast. So it's awesome to connect with you. I appreciate the time.
For sure. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you.